Hello. I am going to be talking this week about the book called The New Capitalism by Eva Darian Smith. Darian Smith was an author, was once a commercial lawyer, and an anthropologist. Interestingly enough, she's Australian. So it's interesting to see what her point of view will be about what's going on in the United States, considering Australia's past with the British trying to indoctrinate the Aboriginal people there. So the book discusses gaming and stereotypes that are created, and some of the stereotypes that were created around gaming that deal with the Native Americans. So, she starts the book talking about how the early idea of the Indian, the term the Indian, is a figment of the white man's imagination. That's what she talks about. She says, it's not even really an accurate term. It was coined by Muslims to describe the indigenous folk who lived near the Sindh River, which is in present-day India. And she talks about, of course, the story about Christopher Columbus and how he was hired by Ferdinand and Isabella to discover a new route to China for Spain. He thought he had landed in, we all know the story. He thought he landed in the Indian subcontinent. He landed in the Dominican Republic. And then, because he saw them there, he just assumed, well, those are the Indians. So she claims that the term really, and remember, this is coming from somebody who has spent time in the United States. She's not from here, but she has spent time in the United States, and she is saying that the term Indian has really just been used to sell things like souvenir cigars and cigarettes and gasoline and cars. And she goes about how to talk about how there was no such thing. There's really no such thing as an Indian, as same as there's no such thing as really a European or an Asian. It's basically, yes, they come from these specific continents, but that's not really a term that you should use to describe them. The way you should describe them is based on their country and their own specific culture. So it's really a culture that should be what's describing people, as opposed to just like a really large umbrella term. Whether you agree with that or not, I don't know. She goes on to say that, and again, she's talking about gaming, but what she wants to do is to kind of set the stage about specific stereotyping towards the indigenous folk. And she says that Hollywood and contemporary stereotypes of the indigenous people, and one thing is she talks about is that while we all know how horribly the Native Americans have been treated in this country, we all know this, the stereotypes have changed over the years. For a long time they were considered just savages, and they had no real business assimilating because they were godless. The Europeans came over with their Bibles and had every right to come over and to take over the land and to, assimilate them, by hook or by crook. So what ends up happening is, right now the indigenous people tend to be the stereotypes. While there's still a stereotype, they tend to be more positive. And when I say positive, they talk more about you look at the Native Americans in a spiritual sense, their ability to commune, their ability to be one with the earth. It's insulting, I think, to a lot of the indigenous folk, because it's not because it's malicious, but it's more ignorant. But I always bring up this. I'm not sure I'm even supposed to be doing this in this assignment, but there is a thrift store in Sterling, Massachusetts, and you go in, and there are right up front there are these big Cupid dolls. It must have been made in probably the 50s or the 60s latest, and the old Cupid dolls with the eyes that flip back and forth, and they look like they're Caucasian structurally, but of course they're painted brown. And I'm sure the people who made these dolls, or the manufacturer who came up with these dolls, I don't think they were being malicious. I think they were just, coming up with their vision as to what Native Americans looked like at that point. And, they had the headdresses and all that type of stuff on. But again, it was about the spirituality. And, I think while it's insulting, I don't know if there's as much, again, malicious intent behind it. And one thing that she also mentions too is in this, for the older people, you might not remember these, the ionized Cody commercials. It was a campaign to stop pollution, and the figurehead of this campaign is a Native American, an older Native American, and basically it's a close up of his face, and he looks at the camera, and a tear drops from his eye, and then it pans out, and you see this giant polluted landfill. But they use the Native Americans because they are supposedly one with the land, they commune with the land. So, it's one of these things where there were stereotypes, but as time went on, they became positive. Even the professor, he showed us, some illustrations, not in our last meeting, but the meeting before, where he had different illustrations of Native Americans created by Europeans, and they're all big, robust, they have big muscles and stuff like that. And so it's not, again, I don't think people are trying to be insulting, but again, these are what these stereotypes are about, and it's about how Indigenous people are, again, to wrap it up, how Indigenous people are one with the land, how Indigenous people tend to view the world much more from of a spiritual bent. Smith will go on in the book, and she talks about how there is an admiration for Indigenous people within the government of the United States, but they also want them to be pacified and assimilated in a way to make them more like this, because this is the most effective way to gain legal control over the tribes through legislation. Of course, such an arrogant attitude to think that we're the gold standard for humanity, so everybody should just want to be like us, like I was talking about earlier. We showed up on these shores with Bibles and guns and just thought, well, this is it. This is our place. We can do whatever we want. And, we justified our attitudes, and, we know about all the Allotment Act of 1887, the Trail of Tears, the Dawes Act, etc. We learn about these in high school and in college, and we understand that what these were really meant to do was to control the Native American population, initially by putting them in reservations where they could be controlled, and also allow for the United States to effectively steal their lands and the natural resources within. The purpose of this book is, she does a nice job. It's a chapter or two about the racism and, the general consensus of what the Native Americans, the Native American stereotypes, really. But there's a stereotype towards gaming, and that's where it gets very different. As we know, the gaming industry is a booming business, especially in the United States. It was really Vegas for a long time after the war. Actually, Vegas was even bigger before that. I believe Vegas came in 1963, was the initial year that it came in as a state, and Lincoln did that because he wanted the taxpayers to help, help pay for the war that was going on. So that was going on. After that, after a while, Vegas is the gold standard. It had all the big casinos, everything that was, when you thought of gaming, you thought of Vegas. And then, of course, New Jersey passes a law and Atlantic City opens up. So the whole thing is, it's this big booming industry in Massachusetts now because they've legalized gambling, and now you have all the apps, and different casinos are all over the place, and you can now bet virtually, which is a big deal for a lot of these people. From what I read in the newspaper, gaming receipts are shooting through the roof. So the book is very interesting. Again, so it's about stereotyping the Native Americans, and then she kind of breaks it down to stereotyping specifically gaming. And, you know, one of the things was because of the reservation system, and because these lands were, you know, considered sovereign when Native Americans started saying, hey, we can make a lot of money doing this. They were sovereign. Then they could run these businesses as they saw fit. As we saw, the state governments were not supposed to have jurisdiction in a lot of these reservations. The federal government did. So what ends up happening is, like I said, everything started in Nevada, and with Nevada kind of builds up with the construction of the Hoover Dam and the Great Depression. A lot of people start moving out there. So, gaming is becoming a big thing. So the question is, where does Indian or Native American gaming start? And this is where she kind of goes through. She kind of lays the foundation of the stereotype, then she lays the foundation of Vegas and, Las Vegas and Atlantic City. So gaming is set. Gaming is a thing now. So where do the Native Americans fit in? That's the big question. So what a lot of people don't realize, a lot of people didn't know, and frankly, I didn't know a lot of it myself until I read this book, was that gaming has always been a very big part of gambling, specifically, where it was a game with some type of stakes, be it high or low, whatever, has always been a big part of Native American culture. And that tribes would enact games all the time, and there would be stakes. There's one, the Kalitas tribe out in California. There was a biographer who talked about in 1872 that the Kalitas tribe would engage in these different types of battling games or rituals, and the losers would have to slash themselves from their ankles up to their knees. That was it. I mean, it was not necessarily money, but there was some type of payment enacted, and they would slash themselves to, appease whatever bad luck spirit presented their luck. So this is going on. Of course, the religious sect gets a hold of these games going on, and of course they want them eradicated immediately because they're godless. They want these, quoted in the book, to abandon these godless games, but they fail to recognize the spiritual significance that actually came from these games, and that it was a significant part of their culture. So when historians start piecing the mythology and the symbolic meanings associated with gambling among the Native Americans, it took a while for that to have to catch on. But I think by the 19th century, there were some anthropologists who started appreciating that connection between gambling and religion. And for a lot of the indigenous people, gambling was a part of their religion, and it was a culturally a very impactful part of their lives. So she kind of flashes forward here. Well, we're going to flash forward because, obviously we can't talk about the whole book, but some of the more important aspects is we flash forward to 1988, and this is the year of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988, which is a response basically about the confusion between federal and state jurisdictional control over the reservation casinos. And what it was basically doing was the federal government was actually looking for some type of protection for the tribes, and it also set up a pretty complex set of laws that the tribes to this day are actually allowed to set. The tribes are allowed to set up on their reservations smaller level games like bingo and things like that on the reservation. But if they actually want to set up like a big Vegas style high stakes casino, they're going to have to negotiate agreements or compacts with state agencies. And this is where it proves to get really difficult. And there's a conundrum here too, because for the longest time, we talked about this too. We talked about this last week about how Native Americans want to have autonomy. They want to have self-determination. So you have a quandary here. If the United States wants them to assimilate, to own these reservations is not necessarily, it's not conducive to that, because then they are they have to pay taxes and they have to pay all the different types of fees that the non-Indian reservations have to pay, like all the ones, Bally's and the MGM Grand in Vegas have to pay. For now, Native Americans don't pay those things. They are exempt from a lot of taxes because these places, again, are on sovereign land. While there is a federal presence of government there, the state generally, they have to negotiate with the state, but the state does not have the ability to pull their licenses or do anything like that. Generally there's a contract drawn out, and both groups have to abide by it. I mean, the state obviously gets paid. They're not going to just let them come in and just take over and do whatever they want to do without some type of compensation. And the compensation, I assure you, is substantial. This is why Connecticut and New York did this, for Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun. Make a ton of money doing these things. So again, they have to negotiate, and what happens is when a lot of people are going to get upset about it, because a lot of the non-Indian gaming commissions are going to get really pissed off, because their belief is, wait a minute, what Atlantic City, great example of this, and she doesn't talk about this in the book, but you can kind of correlate it. When Mohegan Sun and Foxwoods were built, Atlantic City had serious pushback, and they went to the federal courts and they tried to get it stopped, because in Atlantic City's mind, they're going to hemorrhage profits, because they pretty much ran gambling in the East Coast. Now all of a sudden you're cutting a big chunk out of it, because who's going to go to Atlantic City in New England and New York and other parts of the Northeast? And you can just go down to Uncasville, Connecticut. So there's some serious pushback from these very large casinos, but ultimately the states have the right to regulate these, and that's what the federal government said. They have the right to negotiate these contracts with the individual states that they are dealing with. So what ends up happening is you have a dawn of a new era. Foxwoods and all these other big casinos rise up, but a lot of people in the federal government aren't happy about it. So she kind of shifts gears, and she talks about Native Americans and the pro-Native American gaming population, and they actually have a movement for it. They call it the New Buffalo, which I found really interesting, because as we know, buffalo were the lifeblood of the Native Americans on the Great Plains. From food to tools to clothing to shelter, all of these things come from the buffalo. Now a lot of people are saying, okay, the new way we're going to make money, the way we're going to make our way in the world, is gambling. This is what we're going to do. And they, again, used the buffalo as the symbol. So what ends up happening is this happens, the New Buffalo is created, but you do have a great deal of pushback from some of the other reservation communities, because they've been dealing with stereotypes their whole life, and the idea of gambling being their only source of income is something they like. We don't want to be, yes, it can be part of it, but we don't want all of society just to think we're about casinos. And let's face it, it does happen, because if you watch shows like The Simpsons, The Family Guy, both of those shows, which are rich in satire, use, when they talk about Native Americans, it's always a casino. Always. It's always about a casino. And that's what a lot of society has done. We have moved from the idea of Native Americans being almost spiritual to proprietors of casinos, which, that's not great. So there are a lot of people in the population who say we don't like this very much. So there is an Indian historian. His name is Donald L. Fixico. And you have a group you do have groups of people who are saying, okay, what we really need to do is we need to preserve the traditions in both identity, but we need to be able to keep our identity, but we also need to be able to participate in not the bingo, in the business world as well. So by taking bingo money and using it, so taking the money and using it to create hospitals where they have a staff of Indian nurses and Indian doctors, and they're helping the population at large, because let's face it, we know that the facilities in these reservations are not great. So the tribes are taking this money and they're saying, okay, yes, we when they're talking back to the population who doesn't like the idea of gambling being such a big part of their identity, he says, yes, you're right. We are getting a lot of money out of it, but we're taking the money and reinvesting it back in ourselves. They reinvest it into hospitals and schools and various programs, not even just business programs, but types of social services to help their own people, elderly, a feeding program a feeding program that helps, feed young medical students into nursing fields and fields like that. And also they take this money and they put it into political war chests as well. So there is a large, Smith talks about the fact that there is a large group of a large population that believes that it's important to balance out. Let's balance the future. It is the New Buffalo. A lot of them believe is really our best hope for our future, because why? It is a cash cow, and this allows them to maintain their self-sufficiency and their sovereignty. Because let's face it, that amount of money buys you a lot of political capital. So what they believe is, with this, a lot of them believe that with this amount of money, the sovereignty and the self-determination that they've been looking for so long is well within reach. And this is why, we talked about this earlier, a lot of tribes don't want to be assimilated. They don't want to become a part of the United States. They want to be sovereign. They want their own self-determination, because they would lose a lot of money doing this, by becoming part of the United States. So, she also, Smith also talks about how the self-sufficiency and sovereign independence for Native peoples was never, a sovereignty was never the idea or the vision that was going to be endorsed by the federal government. The people who were the original, supporters of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There was an idea that Native Americans should be, again, assimilated into the United States, and just their cultures and their traditions eventually get wiped out. So, she uses one specific casino as kind of the test, and she talks about the Chumash Indian Casino Expansion Project as an example of how indigenous people were exploited. Like it was, they were exploited. They lived out in the Santa Barbara area of California, and what Smith talks about is how beautiful Santa Barbara is. It's a huge retiree community. Lots of celebrities go out there to live, but of course, like everything, there's a very dark history. And at the core of it is the exploitation of the Chumash Indians, who lived there for a long time. And unfortunately, they were exploited. They had all their lands taken away from them, and they were used by the Catholic Church. And they basically were told that you're going to help us run our missionaries, and you'll help us propagate Catholicism, throughout the United States. And this is, of course, they lose in 1833. Everything goes secular. So technically, the Chumash get their freedom, but at this point, it's been generations, and their culture and everything has just been completely blasted. It's gone. So what ends up happening is later on, they get moved to a reservation like everybody else does, but then because of where they're located, it's California, a very, very affluent area of California. One of the most affluent areas in the country is Santa Barbara is one of the most affluent areas in the country. What ends up happening is they decide they want to build a casino. they get the state funding for it, but then when they start doing exploratory, they start taking exploratory measures and stuff like that. What happens is they take a poll of the area. They take a poll of the general surrounding area. And this is where it gets interesting. The people in the area say, the general surrounding area, to almost to a person, they say, no, we don't want it. And well, they're asked why, and they say, well, Indians are lawless, and they don't pay taxes. We don't want these people here. But then they take a poll spread out further in California, and they realize most people want it. Because the people say, my God, the revenues that we can get from this, it's like it can do wonders for our infrastructure, and we can use it for schools and a myriad of different things. 3,500 people go into that, now that it was built, 3,500 people go into that casino every day, and it makes incredible amounts of profits. So when it got to a wider audience, they said about 85% of Californians wanted it. But as you got closer and closer and closer to where the Schumacher were going to actually build it, which it goes up in 1994, most people didn't want it. It's like prisons. We always like we need prisons. We need more prisons. We don't have enough. Some people say I don't, but a lot of people say that. But then when you say, okay, well, we're going to have to build it a mile up the road, people are like, oh, don't want that. Come on, build it someplace. There's got to be someplace else to build it. Come on. So, it goes to show you that the stereotypes that people believed, they don't want them around, but they also say, well, yeah, but they're also really good at running casinos, but we don't want them near us, and that they're lawless and they don't pay taxes and things like that. So it's very interesting. And again, when we think about Native Americans, gaming, this is core. This to me was core to the book. Gaming and games of chance that have some type of high stakes have been part of the Native American tribal traditions probably since before we got here. It's a very important, deep aspect of their culture, games of chance. So they have taken this culture and they have created a niche for themselves. Now, what they can do is they have the ability to, and we talked about this, and this is where I'll kind of wrap things up. They now have the ability to push for their own destiny because they make a lot of money and they're still not assimilated and they're still not under state control in a lot of ways, and they are making money hand over fist. And what does all this money do for you? It allows you to become, for the first time in their history, within the next decade or 2 decades, they're going to become real players in the political scheme of things because they can use money and they can grease palms just like everybody else does, and they can become a real force in politics. And that's a lot of that is because of gaming and the stereotypes that go along with it that, Dorian Smith talks about played a part in propagating this. So I enjoyed the book. I'm glad. I might, the question I would pose to everybody else is what's next? What happens next to the indigenous people in terms of gaming? Does it get to a point where the federal government is saying, okay, we're going to step in, we're going to put a kibosh on this, we're getting too much pushback from the states? What's going to happen? So talk to you soon. Thank you.